Hi, I'm Shannon, the podcast producer here at C-SPAN, and this week on the Lectures in History podcast, a discussion on how civic faith impacted the Cold War. Hillsdale College professor Richard Gamble teaches the class and focuses on how American nationalism incorporated religious elements and symbolism during the Cold War. More after this. C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon Prime. From streaming to shopping, Prime helps you get more out of your passions. So whether you're a fan of true crime or prefer a nail-biting novel from time to time, with services like Prime Video, Amazon Music, and fast free delivery, Prime makes it easy to get more out of whatever you're into or getting into. Visit Amazon.com/Prime to learn more.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The new year brings new health goals and wealth goals. Protecting your identity is an important step. LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, LifeLock's restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Resolve to make identity health and wealth part of your New Year's goals with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
Well, good morning, and I hope you had a good weekend, or if the weekend seems like a long time ago already, that you're anticipating the weekend that's coming. I know a lot of your parents will be here, and I look forward to meeting them. So we're going to think about civil religion, continue to think about it in the context of the Cold War, but a little bit more narrow than that. The two readings you have today more directly address the Vietnam War, right? The Robert Bellah essay is from 1967. The Richard John Newhouse essay is from 1970. So you have the Robert Bellah Civil Religion in America, or American Civil Religion, I guess, one way or the other, from 1967. And then Newhouse's The War of the Churches and Civil Religion from 1970. And he draws directly, as you've seen, directly inspired by Robert Bellah. He's been reading Bellah's essay, and he does some similar things with it, and maybe takes it in a little bit different direction as well. You've already read this semester selections from Will Herberg's classic Protestant Catholic Jew. That shows up in the Robert Bellah essay, and he disagrees with Will Herberg's take on American civil religion, the American way of life. And you've also read the New York Times account of Eisenhower's informal talk delivered in December of 1952, if I remember correctly, right before his inauguration. And you read an article from the 1980s drawing attention to that article and trying to get historians to recognize that in context, what Eisenhower said about religion as the basis of democracy sounds a little bit different when you read it in context. Imagine that. Imagine that. When I was reading Wendell Berry, the next book you're heading into this semester, The Hidden Wound, about race in America, when I got to chapter 7, I blushed a little bit when I read these first two sentences. He said, Wendell Berry writes, "I suppose that it is usually the aim of a writer to produce a definitive statement, one that will prove him to be the final authority on what he has said. But though my aim here is to tell the truth as nearly as I am able, I am aware that the truth I am telling may be a very personal one. The truth, that is, as distorted and qualified by my own heritage and personality." If that applies to the writer, it definitely applies to the teacher. And writing is just teaching anyway. They are really two aspects of the same undertaking. The aim of the writer to produce a definitive statement. That's the temptation. That's the temptation. It's temptation I face today and in every class. I want to give you a definitive statement. That's a very risky thing to do. I want to come across as the authority on this question because I've been thinking about it for over 30 years. But all that means is that I've been thinking about it for over 30 years. It doesn't mean I'm right. It doesn't mean that I'm the authority. So everything I'm laying out today. In fact, it's going to be a little more tentative than I even had originally planned. And I'll tell you why in a moment. So this is to help you to think through some questions, to help all of us think through some questions about American civil religion, what it is, how it functions, what the relation is between civil religion and the government, civil religion and the church, and the relationship between the government and the church. All this is happening at once in any moment of American civil religion. Now, I'm sure I did what all of you did on Saturday, right? I played around with the online version of the Oxford English Dictionary, right? I'm sure that's exactly why you woke up excited to be able to do that on Saturday morning. I got thinking, I was working on this on today's lecture, and I thought, I've looked in the past at the Oxford English Dictionary. I've looked up the word religion, I've looked up civil religion, but let me refresh my memory. When you go to religion, you find that it has a very complex etymology, linguistic origin. It's partly French, it's partly Latin. You will find that expected idea of binding together, a binding together of a community, a religious community, or a binding together of God to man. You will find that there. And then I looked up civil religion, and it gave me these historical examples. You know, the Oxford English Dictionary is set up that way. These historical examples of how the word, when it first appeared that we know of, and how it has been used over the centuries. But then I decided I would look up civic religion, because I knew from my own studies that the phrase civic religion has been common. It's been common in translating works from antiquity. If you look at the old, it's still a very popular translation of Augustine's City of God from the 1860s from England. And the words civic religion are all over the place, as Augustine is taking his theological bulldozer and destroying the old Roman civil religion, that civil religion that had been sustained by the poets, by the philosophers, by the playwrights. That civil religion, that civic religion in that translation, right, Augustine just blasts away at it. So I searched civic religion in the OED, and the OED told me there are no instances of this phrase. And I'm thinking, is there a way to contact the OED and just send them countless examples? So my next step, go to Google. And I looked up civic religion on Google Books in quotation marks, and sure enough, it's all over the place. And I think I sent you a Google Ngram, right? And that's from the OED website. And those are notoriously unreliable. So be very cautious with those Ngrams. And I've cautioned you before about Google's bad habit of giving the wrong date, publication date, to a book. And it shows up on that Ngram. So when I went to Google, I did a little Google Ngram of civic religion. And yes, full of mistakes, but it shows a similar pattern, an explosion of use of the phrase over the last several decades, certainly in the 20th and into the 21st century. But what I found complicated my life. And I love that. I love that. And I keep warning you, right? If you don't find surprises in your research, you're not doing enough research. And this is a beautiful example of that. And I have told you earlier this semester that I've taken a vow before God and man that I will never write about civil religion again. I will never review a book about civil religion again. I get asked to do that all the time. But now I think I'm going to have to write about civil religion again. This is how whole books get started, because you have this nagging question that you don't have an answer to, and you keep going after it. So when I searched civic religion, I found out that this phrase was remarkably common during the progressive era, the social gospel era. It shows up in the 1880s, the 1890s, on into 1910, 1913. It's everywhere. And it's defined and defended and promoted with a high level of specificity. There's a very clear agenda here of saying what a civic religion is and why we must have one in our actual civic society, in our cities, in our communities, in our states, in our nation. First example, and you know my bad habit of when there's too much to do, you bring more material. And this is a good example of that today. This is the first thing I found. My memory is it's around 1909, 1910. It's by a rabbi, a very prominent progressive rabbi, friends with others within the social gospel movement and the progressive movement, by the name of Stephen S. Wise, W-I-S-E. His father was also a prominent rabbi. And I want to read, let's say, the first 3 paragraphs of this and see what you notice. If any of this sounds familiar. The problem of the nation is not that of 50 years ago. Thinking about the Civil War. At that time, the national problem was the problem of state rights. Today, the problem of the nation is the problem of civic duty, a problem which has not grown out of state rights, but it must be admitted, out of civic wrongs. The solution of the civic problem of the nation is to be found in a rebirth of what Phillips Brooks was a very prominent liberal Episcopal minister and actually a bishop in Boston. What he has called spiritual patriotism or civic religion. Nothing less than civic religion will enable the residents of American cities adequately to meet the growing problem of civic life. The hope of a civic revival lies in the dawn of a religion of patriotism. To be possessed of such civic devotion as shall become a very religion of patriotism is to be armed in the face of the civic crisis which impends. The religion of patriotism may sound blasphemous to some ears, but that patriotism be less than a very religion is the conception which has prepared. Let me give the proper emphasis to this now. But that patriotism be less than a very religion is the conception which has prepared the way for the civic corruption of the last decade. We are to serve the state, not only with our bodies as soldiers or policemen, not even with our heads alone as voters, but as Thoreau has put it, with our consciences as citizens. Ours ought to be a religion of patriotism. For America is not a land alone, nor a country, nor a people, but a hope, a vision, an ideal. What nobler religion can there be than the pure love and unselfish service of the noblest, freest commonwealth the world has ever known? And it goes on from there. What do you notice in that? What stands out? What do you got, Daniel?
The thing that stands out the most is him saying that America is not a country.
Okay.
And I would assume he means in the sense of we don't share a common blood or a common origin. So that leaves us with just America as a spiritual ideal.
Yeah. He may have said, I could double check this, he may have said it's not only or not merely, but he thinks it's something higher, as if on your hierarchy, right? A place, a people, a history that would be lower on this hierarchy. But he says that the civic religion is devoted to this ideal America. And I could have given you a lecture that this major social gospel figure, Washington Gladden, a lecture he gave around the same time. And the whole lecture is about the service of an ideal America, the America that we can envision. And he believes it's an approximation of the New Jerusalem, of the city of God on earth. And we ought to be bringing our communities, our nation, into conformity with this ideal, a sort of apocalyptic John on Patmos ideal of the New Jerusalem. Anything else you notice in that? I didn't warn you I was going to do that. But the vocabulary should be familiar to you, right? A religion of patriotism. Even the fact that he's cautious enough to say, to some, this might sound blasphemous, right? But he says it need not. It need not. That it's actually indispensable. Well, what I discovered on Saturday and then continuing to look on Monday is that the use of civic religion is just about everywhere. And a lot being used by a lot of familiar faces from the progressive era, from the social gospel movement of more than 100 years ago. No one, to my knowledge, has ever written about this, has ever noticed this. So I feel compelled probably to write something about this. Some people have found this a controversial claim of mine. I think in a similar way to saying that modern Christian nationalism actually has roots in the progressive movement and in the social gospel movement. Some roots, not all of its roots, that it has some of its ancestry, some of its family tree of modern Christian nationalism actually goes back into the late 19th, early 20th century. The social gospel clergy, some of them were among the strongest, most articulate advocates of making America a Christian nation. A lot depends on what you mean by Christian, what you mean by nation, but there they are, quite explicit about it. And then to find this as a companion to it. So they are also early promoters of civic religion or civil religion. They talk about it in detail. They talk about it frequently. What does all that mean? Well, one thing that means is that when Robert Bellah, the sociologist, right, who says in 1967 that this has gone unnoticed in American history. Yeah, he's being honest there, right? But he says it's been unnoticed, and it's time for scholars now to pay attention to what's always been there, but we didn't have a name for it. We didn't bring it up to the surface and look at it, become self-conscious of it, look at its rituals, look at its beliefs, look at the liturgy of American civil religion. So what this does at least is to add a counterweight to his argument, to say, not only have we talked about this, we've talked about it in prior generations in the most self-conscious way possible. We used just a slightly different word, but we were very self-conscious, not just in recognizing it, but in explaining it, in promoting it, in building it as an indispensable part of a certain political and theological agenda. And I will definitely come back to that. I have a lot more examples here, but for the sake of time, I will not be able to go through these. The British journalist William T. Stead, who wrote a very famous book, If Christ Came to Chicago, ! If Christ came to Chicago, and this is in the late 19th century. Like, what would Jesus notice about Chicago? What would be the sin that would capture his attention? And William T. Stead spoke about the need for a revival of civic religion. There's another man in 1906, James T. White, who wrote, quote, "Citizenship may not be a large enough word for his vision of kind of a civic solidarity, but all the interhuman relationships are included in this civic religion. Religion is relationship, and of all relationships, the civic is the highest, the holiest. For out of this are developed the noblest qualities of character. Now, if you're a devout Christian or devout Jew or devout Muslim, right, that gives you pause to say that the civic religion, the civic is the highest, the holiest relationship of all. So, something to think about. At a serious level, why do we care about this? Why have scholars cared about this? Why have politicians cared about this? Why have preachers cared about this? Because civil religion, no matter what you think about it, and I have my own ideas about civil religion, no matter what you think about it, it taps into one of the most important questions there is in our communal life, in our political life. It addresses that question of what binds together a community. What binds together a community?
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment.
At New Balance, we believe if you run, you're a runner, however you choose to do it. Because when you're not worried about doing things the right way, you're free to discover your way. And that's what running's all about. Run your way at newbalance.com/running.
Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
Robert Nisbet, the sociologist in 1953, published a very important book, The Quest for Community. Some of you may have read this, The Quest for Community. And from that title, you might think that he's a huge fan of all evidence of this quest for community. But one of his concerns in the 1950s is that Americans were looking for community in all the wrong places. That they were expecting something of our national community that it could not provide. A depth of allegiance, a sense of belonging. So where do we find that, right? And we ought to be able to recognize that there are different kinds of belonging, different kinds of community. We have a membership, a belonging in our families. We have a membership, a belonging in our communities. You might be part of some civic organization. You might have been part of a bowling league. You've been part of a community, a rather intentional community. Part of a church. Part of, you're a citizen of your local town, a citizen of your state, a citizen of the United States. But can these types of community provide the same kind of community, the same intensity of community, the same sense of belonging in a community? You might go into, I'm thinking of a Target I went into years and years ago, right? And what does it tell you? They'll have signs about their employees, and maybe there's a door that only the employees can go through, and it'll say, you know, for the Target family. It's funny that we do that. We often hear, why can't this fill in the blank be more like a family? Right? I've never heard anyone in a family saying, why can't this family be more like a college? But we will say, why can't this college be more like a family? I heard that years ago. So we have to be able to recognize different kinds of community. But in the readings today, for Bella and for Richard John Newhouse, at this point in his career, they never say this, and tell me if I'm wrong. They seem to be asking, why can't America be more like a church? Why can't it have that sense of purpose, common cause, mission, destiny, a sense of sin? There's a strong sense of sin in these two writings. What does redemption mean? Right? What will salvation mean? What will revival mean? What does reformation mean? And Bella sees the American civil religion as deeply Protestant, but a certain kind of Protestantism, the endlessly reforming Protestantism. He's got a social activist vision of what this American civil religion will be. All right, let's see if you're prepared for this question. Robert Bella takes you through 3 crises in America, 2 that have already happened, and 1 more that we're experiencing at the moment in 1967. Do you remember what they are? Ethan.
I want to say it's the first 2 world wars and then the Cold War, but I could be wrong.
You want to say that?
Yes.
You have good intentions, good desires, but Brian.
First one is the independence.
Okay.
And then the American Civil War. And then he talks about this idea of the third crisis is America's place in the world with other countries becoming democracies. What is America's role?
Right. And how do we use American power in a revolutionary world? So our first time of crisis was the War for Independence, the revolution. Second time of crisis, the time of testing, the Civil War. And now this third moment, we don't know how it's all going to go yet, but he knows how he wants to deploy American civil religion. And these moments have given us most of the symbols, heroes, events, causes, documents, beliefs of the American civil religion. They came, and he says that the American Revolution was more Hebraic. That's more of an Old Testament phase of our civil religion that we were likely to talk about. I don't think this is his example, but we're likely to talk about George Washington as our Joshua. And he mentions the ideas for the Great Seal coming from Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, and showing the Israelites coming out of captivity, out of the house of bondage and crossing the Red Sea, that this would be the most fitting symbol, they believed, symbol for American freedom, American deliverance from the bondage of Great Britain. Do you remember what he says about the Civil War and what happens there? This is easy. Here's a softball question. If the Revolutionary War is the more Hebraic moment, he says, of our civil religion, then what's the Civil War?
The New Testament?
Okay. New Testament and the more Christian. And he points to Abraham Lincoln as the single most important contributor to this Reformation, this revival of American civil religion. Think about this too. This is 1967. The U.S. has just passed through all the centennial observances of the Civil War. 1961 to 1965, centennial observance of the Gettysburg Address, and there was a lot written about it, about the Battle Hymn of the Republic, about Lincoln's assassination. So he's been thinking about that. He quotes the American poet Robert Lowell, and he quotes Reinhold Niebuhr about what Lincoln contributed. And he sees it as what we could call a Christological contribution, right? About the doctrine of Christ, the person and work of Christ. And he looks at the Gettysburg Address. And this is very similar, for different reasons, but very similar to what I do in American Survey classes. I draw attention to the redemptive imagery in the Gettysburg Address. Brought forth, right? 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth. There's all this language of conception and birth. And at the end of the Gettysburg Address, we arrive at new birth, right? Shall have a new birth of freedom. And that this nation shall not perish. And to anybody in 1863, Right? America knows, most Americans know the King James Version of the Bible backwards and forwards. And you hear those words, shall not perish, right? So there's all this redemptive language, sacrificial language in the Gettysburg Address. And Bella celebrates this. He says, this is what gave us then what we could call our New Testament of our civil religion. But the third time of testing is now the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. He's talking more here about the Vietnam War, although he'll draw some unfavorable comparisons between the way Lyndon Johnson spoke about the Civil Rights Movement to the way he spoke about Vietnam. I'm going to add a little footnote to that, a little correction. I'm going to tweak that a bit with you in just a moment. So this is our third time of testing. Now, a much more challenging question. How does Robert Bella want to use the American civil religion? How does he want to use it? I may not be asking that in the clearest way possible. How does he want to deploy it? In what cause? For what purpose? All right, I'm going to put that on pause for a second. Don't let me forget it. Don't let me forget it. You've got time to scrounge around there in your documents. I'm going to come to this amazing diagram, which answers all of life's basic questions. I want to think about civil religion here as a dynamic relationship between the government, the churches. I'm deliberately keeping that plural, and also I want you to include under that, this is the churches, maybe in quotation marks. So the synagogue, the mosque, it would apply there as well. Not in the same ways, but it would apply there as well. And then this thing we're calling civil or civic religion. There are some very telling comments that Bella makes about how he conceives of religion in a modern liberal democracy. I don't know if you kept track of these. They're really quite striking, and they have a lot to do to his eventual handling, his interpretation of civil religion and its necessity and its usefulness. I would have been tempted, maybe even a few weeks ago, I would have been tempted to draw more of a Venn diagram. And you have the civic and the religious, the civil and the religious. And civil religion would operate in the overlap, this common ground between politics and religion. I don't think that's right, and I don't think that's what Bella is doing, and I don't think that's what Newhouse is doing. And you see that pretty clearly at the end of the Newhouse piece. I don't have a proof text for you right now. It's in there. It's in there. I might have a page written down, but I'm not sure. So for Bella, he says, civil religion is part of the public sphere. It's part of it belongs to the civic side. It's what the government does to promote national unity, to support a war or a cause. In Bella's case, he wants it to be, and now I'm answering my earlier question, he wants it to be for the sake of reform, of social reform legislation, for the sake of civil rights legislation, for the sake of anti-war protest and leaving the Vietnam War. So this belongs to the public realm. And he makes that move, right? He makes that move and places religion, the churches, in the private realm. He draws a line right through here. Says this is the public realm. I'm not sure I ever noticed that so clearly as this last time reading through it. And that's the private realm. And what you do is your own business. This is the vision of modern enlightenment, a certain brand of liberalism that says this is a private matter. This is all internal. It emphasizes religious pluralism, and I'm not saying these things are bad. Religious pluralism, it emphasizes tolerance as a supreme virtue. If you go far enough in this thinking, there were those in the Enlightenment forward who said that religion is a problem to be solved. They're thinking about the 30 Years' Wars. They're thinking about violence following or during and following the Reformation, and they're saying religion is a problem to be solved because what religion does, it makes people passionate. It makes them crusaders for their cause. It makes them willing to fight without compromise. Right? And so you privatize that, and the churches are over there. Now, one of the concerns that later Newhouse will have as he changes his views quite a bit, later he will say, well, what we've been left with is what he called, in the title of a very famous, important book, The Naked Public Square. That's what you end up with, is a naked public square. But how you bring religion into that, right? Good luck. It's what we still debate. And heading up to the election, we argue and argue about. Let's refresh our memories about just what civil religion is. I've argued, and I told you about this before, I've argued that there are really, for purposes of analysis, for thinking theoretically about this, in labels and categories, there are two kinds or two sources for civil religion. One is the elevating of mundane earthly things, elevating them to the status of our civil religion. So taking our heroes from important moments in history, taking a George Washington, a Thomas Jefferson, and you build monuments to them. And their words become really sacred words. We talked about how the Declaration and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights is displayed at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And there's a hush over it. And it looks like a Baroque altar from a church. And we may not even think about that. I think that's part of Bella's point about it just being part of the background. But once you see it, you see it. And you think, well, this isn't just an ordinary everyday thing we're doing. We are elevating these documents to pretty much, as one historian called it, an American scripture. An American scripture. And there's a canon of that American scripture. And we might argue about what belongs in that canon. And especially in the 19th century, we start calling our heroes, right, the apostles, the disciples, the martyrs. We talk about the temple of our liberty. We talk about the ark of our liberties. Now, some of that goes back to classical antiquity. If we speak of the sacred fire of liberty, that goes back to Roman antiquity. Ethan.
Yeah, on page 47, Bella says, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were the sacred scriptures, and Washington the divinely appointed Moses, who led his people out of the hands of tyranny. So it's that same connection, that idea.
Yeah. And this gets added to over time, and it might provoke a lot of controversy, right? Who belongs in that exalted company? Right? And then after the Civil War, right, Lincoln and his words have become part of American scripture. He has this sense of the martyr president, right? And that happens very quickly, happens with his death. He's already elevated into that, I want to say pantheon, but I want to keep it more with the Christian vocabulary that Bella uses. So it can evolve over time, and who belongs in it. This 2 days ago, people arguing once again about Robert E. Lee. I come over here to our token Southerner to talk about Robert E. Lee. And people saying, oh no, right? A certain presidential candidate spoke favorably of Robert E. Lee and surprisingly knowledgeably about it. But that's an argument about who belongs, right? Who belongs within this kind of civil religion. All right, but there's another kind, and it's the one that interests me a lot more. There's another genre, or am I really mixing my metaphors here? Another genre of the civil religion. And that is to take the vocabulary of the church. For simplicity, I'm going to just use Christianity. There's nothing simple about Christianity, but I'm just going to take historic Christianity in all of its varieties. Taking identity. If Lincoln, as he was by some, right, if he's called a Christ figure, right, that's taking from religion for the purposes of the state, purposes of the government, purposes of the next election, purposes of the cause of a political party. Takes the language of actual scripture and uses it for its purpose. We talked about this a few days ago. I gave you some examples. I have one with me. I was going to do this in a different place, but here's a nice example. I thought of this because Bella and I think Newhouse also, and they're writing under two presidents, right? Bella's writing under Lyndon Johnson. Newhouse is writing under Richard Nixon and the escalation, even greater escalation of the Vietnam War. And Bella says that Johnson did a good job, these are my words, but did a good job drawing on the civil religion for the sake of his civil rights legislation, Voting Rights Act, and so on. And he gives examples of that. Is that the section where Bella says that it almost sounds biblical, or is that with another example?
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
Right.
That might have been Kennedy earlier.
Kennedy, right, almost sounds biblical. And what's so funny about that, unintentionally funny about that, is that he's quoting from the Bible. Kennedy in that example is quoting from the Bible. So there's a good reason why it sounds almost biblical, because it's from the Bible. But in those Johnson examples, right, in speaking for passage, calling for passage of voting rights legislation, he's quoting from Scripture. But then Bella gives Johnson really bad marks, really low marks when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to the Vietnam War, and says it was shameful. It is shameful the way that Johnson is really, for Newhouse too, Johnson and Nixon are really betrayers, heretics from the American civil religion. But then I thought, well, what about this that Bella doesn't use? This might sound familiar. This is right out of your American Heritage Reader from a year or more ago. You have there Johnson's speech delivered at Johns Hopkins University in 1965, Peace Without Conquest. Peace Without Conquest. Near the end of that speech, Lyndon Johnson said the following: "Every night before I turn out the lights to sleep, I ask myself this question: have I done everything that I can do to unite this country? Have I done everything I can to help unite the world, to try to bring peace and hope to all the peoples of the world? Have I done enough?" And in context, he's talking about Vietnam. He's talking about an equivalent of the Tennessee Valley Authority, providing hydroelectric power for the people of Vietnam. He's thinking about his own childhood in poverty in Texas and nobody in his town having electricity. So he's talking about this promise and hope of human betterment, material human betterment. But then he continues, ask yourselves that question in your homes. And in this hall at Johns Hopkins tonight, have we, each of us, all done all we could? Have we done enough? We may well be living in the time foretold many years ago when it was said, I call heaven and earth to record this day against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, but that both thou and thy seed may live forever. Any Bible experts know where that comes from? First of all, it comes from the Bible. Yes.
It's like Deuteronomy 28, 30.
So close, it's 30. It's Deuteronomy 30, 30:19. It's from what has been called Moses' valedictory. He does not get to go into the promised land, but these are his, in effect, a sermon to the people of Israel, pleading with them, right? Calling heaven and earth to record, again, that is, heaven and earth will be a witness against you if you do not fulfill your responsibility, if you do not obey the Lord your God. Life and death, blessing and cursing, therefore choose life. This is exactly the way John Winthrop's Model of Christian Charity ends. And he was calling upon his Puritan community to live holy in the sight of God. So this really interests me. Really interests me because it's such a nice example of the other side of civil religion. Not taking the more secular, earthly elements of your nation and elevating them, elevating the flag, right, as a symbol of honor and reverence, duty. It's actually taking the content of religious scriptures and using it for the purposes of energizing the American people, explaining to them the necessity of the war in Vietnam and really what it's all about, and quoting Moses. And we've asked this question before, right? What happens? What happens to these words when they are picked up and lifted and pulled across time and space and used for a purpose utterly different from their original purpose? One option, and this is an option out there, is to feel really good about that. To say, wow, America's being very biblical. And our presidents, seeing back then, American presidents quoted the Bible. Okay, but there are other questions to ask. There are harder questions to ask. Now be careful here. I'm helping to make something visible in your world that you might regret that I made visible in your world. So this happens all the time. Now, there are others who say, I might actually draw again on my board. Others who say civil religion can only be created by the civil side. Civil religion is only civil religion when it's the government, when it's the office holder who does it. So it's always a taking. Sorry, it's always goes back and forth. I've spoiled it for you. It's always a taking or using of symbols. So when an office holder quotes Deuteronomy, that's civil religion. And I have a good friend of mine, and we disagree deeply about this. And he says, that's what he says. And as he's pretty much, I think he would agree with this. He is saying, don't worry so much about civil religion. You can relax a little bit about civil religion. But, so is it just a taking? My view is that there's give and take. It's a taking of religious symbolism and content, vocabulary. It's a taking, but it's also an active giving. You all read the sermon that Dwight Eisenhower heard before He put his presidency behind the legislative push to add "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. You read that sermon. By one definition, nope, that can't be civil religion. Because it's not an office holder. It's not Eisenhower himself doing this. But it's the preacher doing this. And you were surprised by his interpretation of parts of the book of Galatians. More than a little surprised. And applying it to the United States. I can't see enough distinction between the result. The result looks the same, looks identical. So I think, so if you want eventually to have a definition, right? Civil religion is the joint product of both the government and the churches. That example I read to you from Rabbi Stephen Wise, from the Progressive era. He says, what we need is civic religion. We need a revival. It's not blasphemous. So if he says we need civil religion, it seems pretty obvious to me that that's civil religion. All right. Yes, Brian.
How is this rhetoric of like appropriating the Bible able to convince like biblically Orthodox Christians living in America? Like people who are like listening to these speeches, like.
Right. Proving effectiveness. Now, if you want to be, go the cynical route to start with here and say, right, this is all calculated. This is highly calculated political rhetoric. It's manipulative. It's trying to get people either to believe things that just aren't true about our war or this cause. There is a dimension of it that I think you can demonstrate it has always appealed to Americans. Lots of examples of this in the 18th century, throughout the 19th century. Demonstrating as a historian that it is effective political speech is extremely difficult to do. What you can demonstrate, we've talked about this before, what you can demonstrate is when nobody notices. If you have a George W. Bush saying, quoting John 1:5, in the anniversary of 9/11, right? The light has shined in darkness, the darkness has not overcome it. And then there's no reaction to that. And that's just a nice example. But this is Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, liberals. It's a very, very common practice. And I should say, for the record, in no way has the United States been alone in doing this. The American mix of religion and politics is not at all unique. There are some other nations in the world who like to believe that America is unique in making its politics very religious and its religion very political. But if you just look historically, and we could do so much more with this. We could say, what does civil religion look like under a monarchy? We could ask a lot more questions about this. All right, I asked you guys to prepare carefully the new house, and I want to look at that with you. I want especially to look at page 38. And this is the point at which I just assume that I have the right document with me. There it is. There's a lot that could be said here, but 138 picks up the pace. And he has a whole section called Civil Religion and Politics. Richard John Newhouse, at this point in 1970, was a political activist, a very liberal Lutheran minister. He's not happy with the conservative, the Missouri Synod Lutherans. I don't know if anybody here is Missouri Synod Lutheran. He's not happy with them. And the reasons for his unhappiness are worth talking about. And if we have time, we'll do that. So he says here, if you look at the the first paragraph of that section, he quotes Robert Bellah. So this is his go-to source. And we've been doing that ever since. Robert Bellah, the authority, the expert. He has settled this question. He's the one who created this whole field of investigation, so you got to go to Robert Bellah. Okay, so he starts with Robert Bellah, and then he adds this. I believe, however, that the conflict is not between religion and politics, not if one understands that American politics includes the civil religion. That is a Bellah point, right? So here's Newhouse. American politics includes the civil religion. So who's it belong to? But he's not going to leave it at that. Described by Bellah as a set of religious beliefs, symbols, and rituals growing out of the American historical experience interpreted in the dimension of transcendence. We haven't talked about that dimension of transcendence yet. This is why Bellah cares so much about the civil religion, because he believes that in a modern secular age, it provides a prophetic witness against the United States of America, a sense of judgment looming over America. So that's why he cares about this transcendence, so-called. Then Newhouse continues, the conflict over Vietnam is rather between the government, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, right? The government and the American civil religion. A conflict within the American political enterprise. What's going on there? What's going on there? A terrible leading question, or not leading question. What's his complaint? What's his complaint against them? Yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
It seems as if, like he says later on the page, Americans think of their religion in terms of their church membership rather than in terms of belonging to civil religion generally. And so they're not able to see a conflict between civil religion and the beliefs that they themselves hold.
Okay. And he's later even going to say that he wants the churches to make effective use of the civil religion, right, to oppose the Vietnam War and to push for civil rights. It's a fascinating dynamic. So what's wrong with Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon? They are actually now operating politically outside the American civil religion. They're outside that church. So they are betrayers. They're traitors to it. They are, we use the consistent language, they're heretics. And Bellah wants the American civil religion, his version of what he believes the true, authentic American civil religion, to rebuke Lyndon Johnson. Right? You're doing a great job on domestic politics, right? You're doing it right. You're deploying the American civil religion in the best of the tradition. And you might even be helping to build take that new direction of the American civil religion in this third time of crisis. But Vietnam, you're traitors to the real American civil religion. So Newhouse says the same thing. Then, yeah, I think where you were reading, Daniel, it's, find my place here. Go to the second column here. Church members think in terms of specific Christianity rather than in terms of civil religion. That's what you were referencing, right? But then the next paragraph, the debate about the morality of the Vietnam War is not then between the government and Christianity. It's not the debate between the government and Christianity, but between the government and the American civil religion, where there's a struggle going on here that shouldn't be there between the two. The churches rally to the support of and give a degree of legitimation to that interpretation of the civil religion that protests the war. There's a lot happening in that sentence. So he wants the churches, like his own Lutheran congregation in New York, and he founded an organization for clergy and others to oppose the Vietnam War. He's out in the streets marching in Vietnam War protests. He wants the churches to be faithful to the real American civil religion. Back to Bella. He says, I mentioned earlier, the American civil religion is largely Protestant in its sensibilities, but it's one version of Protestantism. Robert Bella himself, as a child, was raised in a social gospel church early in the 20th century. His definition, we could go back and find this in the essay. Robert Bella says the American civil religion, because of this Protestantism, has always been activist, always been evangelistic, has always been concerned with social reform. He sees it as rooted in that 19th century reformist Protestantism. So you got to think about this. So it's one version, one brand, one stream of American Protestantism that Bella then attaches civil religion to. What does, I asked you a moment ago about the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. What does Newhouse think about the Missouri Synod churches and their response to the war, to the Vietnam War? Yeah, Brian.
Do they have like a neutral response because they're like stressing the difference between the secular and the sacred?
Right.
Yeah. Right.
And they want an apolitical, right? An apolitical pulpit, an apolitical church. What I found surprising about that, this is only 53 years ago. He wrote it in 69, so 54, 55 years ago, that Newhouse could say this and not expect contradiction from his reader. That, you know, those conservative Christians, they keep that separation between religion and politics. Is that the reputation today, right? In the media? Is that the reputation? And there is a powerful selective amnesia going on about this story. That it's today, the impression is out there that it is only conservatives who are promoting the mixing of religion and politics, who are doing their politics as if it's religion. There's a very selective amnesia about all of this. But to be able to say, yeah, that's what's true of those conservative churches. They're very, very careful about the boundaries between church and state. They're very careful to stay apolitical. They want their pastor to be apolitical. You've probably seen Twitter, Facebook, somebody said several days ago, if a fairly prominent person said, you pastors, if you are not telling people how to vote on Sunday morning, right, your congregation, like, you need to quit. And you congregants, if you're not learning how to vote on Sunday morning, you need to find a new church. This is conservative voice. Right? It's different. It's very different now. Somebody I can't say I know, I'm friends with in the Facebook fake world. I'm friends with this person I've never met and really have no idea who he is. But he posted the other day, I cannot be friends with somebody who claims to be a Christian and is a Democrat? Wow. Wow, that's pretty strong language. So the way we politicize our faith, where we place these stakes, these high political stakes.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
Here's an idea for you. Here's an idea. I think today, given all this history, very rapid survey of history, I think today we probably have two competing American civil religions. I don't know how far back to take that story. Maybe that's always been the case. Maybe it's something that has just intensified or become more obvious. Two civil religions, and I think operating in the ways I've described. Do we have two civil religions, two civic faiths in America? Is there a different list of heroes and apostles and martyrs? Different set of documents, different readings of the same documents. That's been going on for a long time. Do we have two competing ways of politicizing the church? Maybe. A more right-wing Republican way of politicizing the church and a more left-wing liberal democratic way of politicizing the church, each getting angry at the other's politicizing of the church and pointing it out and being appalled by it. Quoting different parts of the Bible, you could probably make a case for that. There might be more than two. Remember, this is a schema, and those of you who know me best in this room know that I don't like schemes. I don't like pouring history into these pre-made categories. Something can go very wrong with this kind of simplification. We'll let the sociologists do this. We'll let Bella do this. This makes me uncomfortable because we might find out that the story, the very messy story, is all happening in here outside of my categories. Probably true. So if I say two competing civil religions, I better be open to the possibility that there are three or four or five. Maybe some older versions have faded away. Maybe there are other emerging civil religions. And there are also, this is what gets overlooked in the study of American history. Ask Dr. Hart about this and his book, particularly The Lost Soul of American Protestantism. The historians look at the dramatic conflict, the arguments. And so you would think that the 1920s was a story only about the fundamentalists and the modernists having a war with each other. And you forget about everybody else who doesn't fall into those two categories. Here, what about those who take quite a different view of civil religion? Or are comfortable with one version of civil religion and not comfortable with another version of civil religion? Are more comfortable with the honoring the flag, right? But there are some religious groups, right, that will not salute the flag. So we have differences there about how far people will go in honoring the nation. But those who are comfortable with the flag, comfortable with Memorial Day parades and 4th of July parades, these civic activities, but then are uncomfortable with the taking or the giving of the content of the religion for the purposes of the state. I can think of people like that. I was so glad that Newhouse mentioned the Missouri Synod, Lutherans. who are very careful, the most conservative ones are very careful to guard the distinctions between the two kingdoms, right? The heavenly kingdom and the earthly kingdom. You went to an LCMS high school.
I did.
Did you get taught that?
I think so, yeah. They talked it's that idea of we are almost like warriors on this earth, and then we celebrate once we're in heaven. Like it's the church triumphant versus the church militant.
Right. And language of the kingdom of God's right hand, the kingdom of God's left hand. God is sovereign over the earthly affairs and eternal affairs, but he rules them in different ways. And there might be those who affirm this theology or something similar to it, who get very uncomfortable about crossing these boundaries, and who tend to notice these things, who tend to notice when the politician takes hold of what belongs to the church and the church's identity, or when the church gives to the government what is, willingly, sometimes enthusiastically giving to the government what is its own identity. That's part of the work I did with City on a Hill. You see people enthusiastically calling America the city on a hill, when that name, that identity, is a gift from Christ to his disciples, and by extension to the church. I have one more point, but I'm going to wrap up with this, that you've heard me say repeatedly, that I want to issue this as a challenge. If you are interested enough in this topic to pursue it, to research it, to write about it, I think it is long overdue that we put Robert Bellah aside. His influence, his framework that he gave us in 1967 has proven to be so powerful that it's actually become something of an intellectual prison. It helps us to see certain things, but I believe it prevents us from seeing other things. And I think it needs to be put aside. I believe that the whole question of American civil religion needs to be taken up by historians. It has been dominated by people from other fields, especially by sociologists. It's time for historians to do the hard work of looking at these moments of creation of American civil religion and see if we can put give it more historical weight and substance to it, and less theoretical. Watch it happen. Watch it in the making. Watch the controversies over American civil religion, and worry less about neat categories, neat frameworks. So with that, that's my admonition to you. That's the end of my sermon today. And enjoy reading Wendell Berry. Some of you I've talked to already are enjoying it very much, and you can learn how to write from Wendell Berry as well. So with that, I'll see you on Thursday.
Thanks for listening to this week's Lectures in History podcast. To find even more history content, visit our website at cspan.org.